Before I begin, I would like to thank the BAA and the audience for coming to hear a talk about one of our most recent discoveries at Jelling. If you look at the image above, you can see the Jelling monuments. They were since 1994 a World Heritage Site. They have attained almost iconic status in Denmark and outside as a physical manifestation of the transformations that took place in the Viking Age, not only in Denmark but also in the rest of Scandinavia and in other areas. The monuments would be well known to most Viking scholars and to a lot of other people also. What you're looking at, you can see two runestones standing in front of the present Romanesque stone church. There are two grass-covered mounds. You can only see the northern one here. The northern one covers a burial chamber, whereas the southern mound hides the remains of a huge stone setting. These monuments have been depicted and discussed by antiquarians and scholars since the late 16th century. So it's no new sight. And you might think that all had been said about Jelling that needed to be said. But today we can see that new excavations initiated by the local museum and continued by the National Museum Jelling project have revealed new monuments that we never thought might be there, so that the standing monuments that you see here, even though they are impressive, they were part of a far greater whole that has surprised people quite a lot. Let's see what happens now. Yeah. So just to make sure that none of you are in doubt as to where we are in Denmark, Jelling is situated in Jutland, that is the western part of present-day Denmark. Here, King Gorm the Old raised the first smaller runestone in honor of his wife Quintura, presumably towards the middle of the 10th century. And it was followed, according to current datings, around 965 by a runestone commissioned by his son in honor of the son's parents, King Gorm and Quintura, and not least also to commemorate his own magnificent achievements. So the father and the mother are the occasion, but the point is to demonstrate who he is. And the inscription therefore also reads, King Harald commanded this monument to be made. I'll just show you. Yep. Commanded this monument to be made in memory of Gorm his father and in memory of Thorvi his mother, that Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. And the words are fairly easy to read, but the meaning of the words is not self-evident. What exactly did the king mean when he won Denmark for himself? Did he conquer previously smaller independent kingdoms? Did he regain territory lost to the Germans? Or did he, as we are inclined to believe today, prevail over other contenders to the throne? And what did he imply when he made the Danes Christian? We know today from archaeological finds that there were Christians before Harald Bluetooth, and I would think that there were pagans after Harald Bluetooth. So what did he actually mean? Those are questions that I think are important, but no less so are the questions of by what means and strategies did Harald reach his goals and communicate those goals to his peers, to his followers, and to his subjects. If we look at the runestone from a modern point of view, we could call it a monumental piece of self-promotion. Its setting was equally self-promoting, especially after the most recent excavations. We know today much more about Viking Age Denmark than the early antiquarians did, so we can put today Jelling in a wider context. Over tea we were talking about written sources, and I have to say that like many prehistoric and early historic sites, Jelling is not recorded in contemporary written sources. The name Jelling does not appear anywhere. Later sources suggest that it was a site of some significance, and towards the end of the medieval period it may also have had administrative functions. And throughout the centuries it has been a focus of royal tradition and royal memory. I've put in here two of the first references we have to Jelling. We have one from 1185, when a chronicler, he records how Queen Thyra and King Gorm, the parents of Harald, were laid to rest, according to pagan custom, in 2 mounds close to the royal estate. And around 1200, Saxo Grammaticus, he used the term Villa Jellungam. The cadastre of King Valdemar from 1231 lists Jelling among the properties of the crown, and Jelling remained royal property until the early 18th century, and that is a sort of indication of the importance it had. The territorial divisions were named after Jelling, supposedly, anyway, and about 1300 the Jelling Harald is absorbed by the Turbin Harald, and you can see here from one of the seals from that Harald, or 100 you might call it in English, it continues, even though the center is not Jelling, it continues to commemorate the site, because we cannot doubt that what we see here is a church between 2 mounds, but viewed from a bird's eye perspective. Archaeological excavations, they have taken place in Jelling since the early 19th century. And you could say that the excavations, the techniques involved, the documentation has followed the development of archaeology as a scientific discipline. So we have a continuous process where we get new data, some of it provoked by accident, some of it in response to questions raised by contemporary society or by scientific research. Every time we have a new interpretation, it triggers debate and leads to new questions. The 4 images that are here on this slide show the 4 major campaigns in Jelling. The first one, the discovery of the burial chamber in the North Mound in 1820. That was followed by excavations in both the South and the North Mound in 1861, commissioned by the King Frederik VII. And then it was followed by a re-excavation in both mounds in the 1940s, where you can see they chose a different technique, but it was still manual labor. And then finally the excavations in the church in the 1970s. And today we can see that the pendulum has swung again towards new questions. We need new empirical data to proceed. Because what we had when we started on the Jelling project was the interpretation based on the previous excavations and the 1970s excavations of a dynastic monument. This is the model by one of the major excavators in Jelling, Knud Krogh. It was based on his own and earlier results. He had suggested that as a point of departure we had a Bronze Age mound, the core of the North Mound, and against this was built a ship setting, stones, large stones, 170 meters in length. He suggested also that the small rune stone raised by King Gorm had perhaps been part of this monument. The North Mound, let's see, you've got here now the layout again, the rune stone of King Harald midway between the centers of the 2 mounds. dendrochronology came up. We have a church here also, proceeds a bit slowly. Now we have the dates. So the chamber in the North Mound was built apparently, according to dendrochronology, in the winter 958-59, very exact date, whereas the South Mound was commenced slightly later in the 970s, and work on it may have continued well into the 980s, and it has now been suggested that it may not have been completed until the 990s, meaning that work on the South Mound may have continued beyond the reign of King Harald. So we have two burial chambers in Jelling, one under the North Mound and one under the present church. These two burials, they are both quite unusual in location, and the nature of the two burials, their stylistic similarities in the objects, and the short distance between them, only about 50 meters, would suggest that they were that both chambers belong to the same family. The matter of debate is whether they were actually made for the same person. Knud Krogh suggested that the person buried in the chamber beneath the church had been transferred to the church from the North Mound. In consequence, since the burial beneath the church was a male burial, Knud Krogh assumed that the person buried in the North Mound was King Gorm, whereas the early archaeologists, they had said that burial in the North Mound was that of Queen Thyra. So here we have an example that everything has changed, and today Queen Thyra has actually lost her burial. No one knows any longer where she was buried, and we still have the same problem. So we have, at the end of the 20th century, only 15 years ago, this was the model, the accepted model of the historical development of Jelling. And then, the first indication that we might have to revise everything and rethink the model came in 2006. A magnetic survey conducted by the local museum revealed large monoliths in the area north of the North Mound. The interesting part of it was that a large post hole and the point of these stones was in exact alignment with the axis between the known monuments. And this led to a suggestion that the ship setting in Jelling was not 170 meters long, it was 350 meters long. Preliminary dates suggested that it had been created between the late 9th century, that was a carbon-14 dating, and provided the two parts, the southern and the northern part, fit together, that it had been constructed before the South Mound was commenced in 970. Subsequent excavations by the local museum revealed a few buildings, and as you can see also in the bottom image, evidence of a very large palisade. So the palisade was the starting point of our project. What was this? Was this really something that belonged to the monuments, or was it a separate structure? And we gained a very generous financial support from the Byggruppen Foundation, so we have been able to continue excavations. But today, we started with non-destructive methods, just to gain an overview. And we started by looking at the free area to the north of the monuments. And we did this with reference to other sites in Denmark where they had found buildings, fence lines, numerous artifacts. And we tried to see where can there be something that perhaps supports this, an interpretation of this site as a residence rather than just a palisade complex. But the geophysical analysis, this is electromagnetic survey, revealed no positive evidence of any structures. We had, however, an impression of the landscape, and you can see the redder, the more red the signs are, the more wet area, the more wet the area is. So what we see is that here we have a heavily waterlogged landscape, but otherwise there was nothing really apart from former burial mounds. Then we did a magnetometer analysis, and again, it did not really reveal anything. Even the palisade that we knew to be there could not be seen here clearly. But there was this large patch, I can ask you to remember the large black patch over to the right. So having tried these non-destructive geophysical methods, we went to a more traditional archaeological method. We excavated trial trenches. I wouldn't say mile upon mile, but there were quite a few kilometers here. We covered a little more than 10 hectares, and those 10 hectares, they confirmed our impression of a very limited activity north of the mounds. Apart from a few Stone Age and Bronze Age finds, the area was surprisingly empty. And it was very disappointing to us. And it was particularly disappointing to our colleagues who had worked on a very important site in Sjælland, where thousands of metal objects had come to light in the course of the excavations. At Jelling, we did not find thousands of metal objects. We have, I think, less than 20 datable metal objects. And surprisingly, disappointingly, not one of those metal objects is in the Jellinger style, named after the objects found in the North Mound. So that was a little bit disappointing. As you can see here, the number of trial trenches and the area covered. The first sign of settlement was 300 meters northeast of the monuments. A 23-meter long building, probably from the late 10th century. And two of the finds that we have recorded, a 7th century gold tremesis, 7th century, not 10th century, and an animal brooch from the 11th century, again not 10th century. So we were left with the question, are these results, is that a true reflection of Jelling in the Viking Age, or was it an effect of later disturbance and destruction? We looked to evidence from other places in Jelling, and I looked at the old collections of the Danish archaeologist Jens Jakob Asmussen Worså, collections that are now in the British Museum. And I have to say that none of those collections revealed anything of significance. Worså's collection has no Viking Age from Jelling, although he, in his youth, travelled the parish, travelled the surrounding parishes, and gathered everything he could. He has not left anything from the Viking Age. So, presumably, this image is correct. We have, let's see, we have a lot of things going on south of Jelling. The square marks the palisade, just if you're in doubt. We have a lot of dots south of the town. They are from excavations in the 1980s. They have revealed examples of Viking Age settlement reaching back to the first millennium and even earlier. So we have actually 2,000 years of settlement history in the area south of Jelling, but there's nothing spectacular in it. The only thing that is really out of the ordinary is a weapon burial from the 2nd century. So there is about an 800-year gap between the real activity. So we didn't have that much to go on. And you can see here sometimes the Iron Age is revealed in aerial photography. On a good summer, you can actually see the houses south of Jelling, but you can't see the Viking Age. Ongoing excavations in the two dots to the right there may reveal more evidence of Viking Age settlement, but that still has that is ongoing as part of the town development. So we have a few coins, but you could see we have our tremises from before, we have a few dirhams, we have an Otto Adelheid Pfennig, and we also have a fraction, an eighth of a Saxon Pfennig that could be contemporary with Harald Bluetooth, but could also be later. And you could say that, well, we've got about 3-4 centuries of coins, but less than 10 coins from 3-4 centuries does not give you a trading site. So it was not an extensive trading site. We have a few other finds, a very, very battered oval brooch from the 9th century, or the early 9th century, and a bird brooch which has parallels on the continent around 800, but that is it. And when I just show you this is what the site of Tissø in Sjælland looks like. And that was a status which is quite some time ago, more than 11,000 metal artifacts, illustrating that this was an important site. Some of the artifacts demonstrate that here you had armed men within the complex. We have a lot of objects that are related to cult activities, Thor's hammers especially, but as you can see also a brooch that is interpreted as a Valkyrie scene. We have weights, we have metalworking debris, and the bottom find is a very interesting thing because that is a Byzantine seal from the Byzantine Empire, indicating that a site such as this was a place of interest that the people from Byzantium might have wanted to visit to acquire resources for the imperial army and perhaps also recruit men for the army, but not in Jelling. So in 2010 we returned to our complex and said, well, okay, let's find out if we can get more information on the palisade itself. We initiated 4 small excavations to confirm the line of the palisade and 1 large-scale excavation. 15,000 square meters were uncovered in the northeast quadrant, that is in the lower left-hand corner. And it revealed the full extent of the palisade. So we have a rhombic structure, 360 meters in side length, surrounding an area of 12.5 hectares. And we hope this year, and I'm going to see if this works, we hope over here, in that area, the owner of the farm, who was very much against us, he has left his farm, and we hope that we can take up the grass in his garden and perhaps find a bit more of the palisade and ideally find a gate facing the army road through Jutland. That would be really nice, but maybe that's to be seen. Here you can see what the palisade looks like in the surface. When you go down to the subsoil level, you see the dark colorings of the palisade, and to the right you can see the northwest corner. The corner you saw a few slides ago was the northeast corner, so now we have both the northeast and the northwest corner. You can also see one of our problems. The topsoil is very thin, and the measuring rod there goes through a modern ditch. If it had just hit a half a meter to one side, it may have ruined the corner, so we couldn't see it. So it is very threatened. In the southern part, it's a bit better preserved. Here you can actually measure, in the soil colorings, you can measure the size of the wooden planks and the posts. So you've got wooden planks in the palisade line, 15 by 30 centimeters in cross section, and then you've got posts on either side of the palisade line, 25 centimeters in cross section. So here we have an impression of what the palisade may have looked like, what it may have looked like there. Our excavations were in the northeast quadrant. They were even more rewarding because here we found actual buildings, and you can get an impression of our method. I'll show you a few images of that later. The two men to the right, they are standing in this dark patch that we saw in the magnetometer analysis. And again, this was rather disappointing because there was nothing in the patch, and once we knew exactly where it was possible to compare with this image, an aerial photo from 1963, and you can see what the dark patch is. It's a water tower in the field that has been removed, and what we saw in the analysis was just the remains of a water tower. So no Viking Age there. We excavated by large-scale surface stripping. You can see here, because there is next to no cultural deposit and the topsoil is very thin. So our only option was to go down to subsoil level and record all the post holes that we can see. Unfortunately, this was very plain sailing because the area was so shortly used for such a short time, and there was no real overlap between buildings. So surface stripping, where all post holes were recorded, and in many cases sections and soil samples were taken for further analysis. And you can see here now how clearly the remains of the buildings stand out. The best preserved is the one to the right, but to the left you can see the straight line of the palisade, and you can see a similar building. The building came up, and it is about 23 meters long, and you see at the one end an annex at the one gable. It had a porch on either long side, diagonally opposite each other, and the whole layout of this gave us an inkling of the date, because this is a typical building type of the second half of the 10th century. So this is King Harald's reign, and unfortunately again the finds were not that plentiful. The only sizable object was a Bronze Age urn cremation in one of the buildings. So we have now evidence that yes, in the Bronze Age the site was used as a cemetery, perhaps a mound also, and that had long since vanished, but it didn't really help us on the palisade. Yes, and here our excavations continued. You can see how incredibly straight the palisade is. This is the eastern line where we have excavated 160 meters of the palisade and no gate. To date we have excavated or exposed about, say, 30-35% of the full extent of the palisade. And until now we only have the one gate that you see to the left. One gate in the northern line. It seems rather small when you look at the whole line of 360 meters, but it is still a sizable gate, and it is defined by 3 sets of posts, indicating that it was not just a simple gate, but rather an arcade about 4 meters long, perhaps covered and perhaps with a gate at either end. So sizable. and the width is about 2.4 meters, so two riders would have no trouble passing each other, and you could get a carriage in and out. But still, we only have the one to the north. And we did some further excavating details of it, and something came up, as you can see here, that some of the post holes in the houses, they were very dark, also in the palisade, and there was a high concentration of charcoal, which suggests that the palisade and the buildings may have burnt down. There was also a building of a type dated to around the year 1000, which gives us a terminus antiquum for the palisade. So it was built presumably in that second half that we have as our date frame, with the buildings and the monuments and this later building. But the second half of the 10th century isn't really enough when we're looking at Gorm and Thyra and Harald and the political developments of the time. So we hoped that we could get some more exact dates, and we actually did, because once we had identified the palisade, town development proceeded, and town development required that we empty the pond in the middle of the town and do a bit of landscaping and so on. So everything proceeded with landscaping, and you can see here what came out of it. Empty the pond and see what's in it. And we didn't have high hopes that there might be something, because we had pictures from the 1940s, and everyone in the town said that they could remember when the pond had last been emptied and cleaned, of old bicycles and things like that. But in the lower levels there were remains of oak posts, and the point was then, are these oak posts a 19th century strengthening of the edge of the pond, or are they really old? Carbon 14 dating said Viking Age. So we decided the following year to empty the pond once again and excavate. And this is what the excavation looked like. Small excavation, and a lot of people in it. People who have different, who represent different disciplines, the archaeologists and the natural scientists, and then with the white hair, the local film man who has, since the 1970s, filmed every excavation that has taken place in Jelling. The point was here that we really found the palisade. But before I'm going to show you that, you can just see it slightly in the picture. I'm just going to show you a section. The section of this excavation showed us a layer or a sequence that indicated surely that this was a palisade that had been raised in a ditch that had been dug into this light blue clay. We have on the one side, we have the oak timbers in the middle. You can see the clay that had been dug up from the ditch and layered on top of the bottom, and you can see some of the mixed soil and clay to the right that goes into the ditch again. The most interesting thing was perhaps, well, it's barely, you can barely see it, but it is a very, very thin line of charcoal, oak charcoal, and it supports this idea that the palisade had perhaps been burnt down, and that this layer of burning came into the pond also. The wood is slightly it slants a bit into the palisade area, but that is presumably caused by the pressure of the soil in the at the bottom of the pond. And when we look at the timbers, you can see here under excavation, the timbers, they stood exactly in line where we would expect them to be if they were part of the southern line of the palisade. And the construction the timber remains, they look exactly like the interpretation of the soil colorings that we had seen before. We have a line of massive vertical planks, and then we have the evenly spaced vertical posts on the inner side and the outer side. It was not sunk into the pond, but it was, as I said, dug into the pond, and the timbers had been prepared before they were lowered into the ditch. And you can see in the bottom image to the left, there is just a small wedge of oak that had been inserted under one of the planks, possibly to correct its position or to adjust its height. But there is no other evidence of extensive woodworking on the site. So we must assume that the timbers for the palisade have been prepared elsewhere, either in Jelling or outside Jelling, which would make it easier to transport the timbers to Jelling. And then the date. We hoped that the timbers could give us a good date for the palisade. We took 11 samples, and all of the datings, they fell within a window of 958, 985. So it was definitely in the reign of King Harald Bluetooth. And there was one sample, even though it did not have the bark preserved, there was a bit of splint. And the dendrochronologist Niels Bonde, he proposes that it has a felling date of 968. So the palisade was constructed either at the same time as the North Mound or shortly after. And one of the interesting things is also that it ties in with construction work at the Dannevirke. So, to summarize, as a significant result of our excavations, we have now added scale to the site, and we have defined space. Defined space of 12.5 hectares. That's about 5 times the size of a normal manor site, like the one with the many detector finds from Sjælland. And you can see that the measurements, they go down into detail, so that we have 360 meter sides, a proposed length of a ship setting of 360 meters. We can see that the buildings to the north and east, they are placed at the same distance from the corner, and we can see that the distance between the buildings and the palisade corresponds to half the length of the building. So someone with a serious knowledge of layout and building was involved in this project. So this is our excavation, and then if we do a reconstruction, then this is what it might have looked like. This is what the palisade complex could have looked like. We have a heavy palisade, we have heavy buildings with slanting posts, typical of the second half of the 10th century, but we don't have much more. And you can see here the gate. This is one suggested interpretation of the gate. So we have a massive complex that shares details with some of the building works that are associated with King Harald. And I'm just going to show you some of them. Across the country, a massive bridge. I'll give you a few more details on that. Circular fortresses, and then building works at the Dannevirke, the southern border from Denmark, between Denmark and Germany in this period. So for Jelling now, we can say that from being a place viewed primarily as a place of commemoration, burial and commemoration, it now seems to be a place of activity, but short-lived activity, and activity which took place within a clearly defined and controlled space. And many of these sites, they share some of the same history. So here we have our Jelling complex now put on the map together with the other building works ascribed to King Harald. I'm just going to show you some of these shortly. There. Built the Ravning Enge Bridge, so-called Ravning Enge Bridge, which lies about 10 kilometers south of Jelling, where we have a massive bridge, about 700 meters long, built across the widest part of the river valley. And you can see the piles. They are massive oak piles sunk into the meadows, and they are 30 by 30 centimeters in cross section. That is double the size of the Palisade planks. It may have been associated with Jelling, but it was built around 980, so it's slightly later than the Palisade. We have the Trelleborg fortresses, circular, strictly circular ramparts with moats, streets that cross each other at right angles, gates towards the four corners of the compass, buildings inside strictly ordered into courts. That was part of the inspiration and why we would like to see more buildings in Jelling. We have a new site in Sjælland, Eastern Sjælland, where they have the same structure, and you can see the inner wooden timbers in the rampart. It also has gates to the corners of the compass, but we haven't got the certain evidence of buildings inside yet. They're still looking for them, and this is a tentative reconstruction of what they might look like, but we haven't got them yet. The bottom left image shows you burnt timbers from one of the gates, which provided a carbon-14 dating, again securely linking this site to the 10th century. So if we look at them all, we can see these massive building works, great big building works, and in Jelling, the right angle cross that we see in the circular fortresses is just turned 45 degrees, and we can see the diagonals between the corners in the complex. They cut each other at right angles precisely over the North Mound, so there can be no doubt that the North Mound and the Palisade are linked. And you can also see the measurements. If we look at Fyrkat in Jutland, inner diameter 120 meters, Agersborg, northern Jutland 240 meters, Jelling 360 meters. So that leads to the question, is this a coincidence, or is there really this master builder or master builders behind these sites? And you can see the size of Jelling if you take Agersborg and put it inside. So it is really a huge complex. It was natural for us to look at the fortresses for parallels to the buildings. You can see here Jelling below, Fyrkat above. We thought at the beginning that the fortresses might have formed the inspiration for the buildings at Jelling. Today we are more inclined to look at it the other way round, because we have a division into 5 parts in the fortress houses, really integrated 5 parts in the building, whereas in Jelling the building proper is divided into 4ths, but the 5th part is the annex. So we believe today that the buildings at Jelling, they are not inspired by the fortresses. If anything, it's the other way round. That led us to look at the farms around them. And here you can see a series of main buildings from Viking Age farms in Jutland. They are characterized by living quarters and stabling at the one end, shorter part. And if you take away the stable or the byre part, then you have an exact prototype for Jelling. So our idea was Jelling is probably inspired by the traditional architecture in the farms of the time. And the farms of the time, they were not known when the previous excavations took place in Jelling. Farms from the Viking Age, they are something that we know from the 1970s onwards. And Vorbasse here was one of the first sites to be excavated. It's only about 30 kilometers southwest of Jelling. And as you can see here, we have the fence, and especially in the lower one, the straight lines of the fence. We have a similar layout with smaller buildings along the fence lines. And then in the middle, we have the most important building. And this idea of the most important building being placed in the middle of the complex is repeated in this site, Lisbjerg also in Jutland, and then the manor site at Tissø, the one with the 11,000 or so metal artifacts. What you see here is a traditional way of structuring a farm, that you've got your fence line, you've got your storage buildings, workshops along the edges, and then you've got your main building in the middle. And in Lisbjerg, you have a main building, traditional architecture, which appears to have been replaced by a wooden church, which was then replaced by the present stone church. So here we have a development in the site from farm to church with cemetery that very much resembles what we have in Jelling. And this is why we looked to the old documentation. Was Hall correct in interpreting all the buildings he identified in his excavations in the church as churches? Or should we perhaps look at least the early ones and see if there is a greater similarity with the traditional hall architecture? And the person who went through all this documentation came up with a first building that might have looked a bit like this. It's incomplete, but it looks like the eastern end of a hall. So it would be an idea to look at Jelling and see whether we might not have a hall as the first main building inside the Palisade complex, but that does not preclude it, or rather, that does not mean that it did not have Christian functions, because architecture does not have to be the recognizable church with nave and choir. It could also be a ritual building continuing old traditions. Just to show you this, an earlier site which we are excavating in these years, where we have found some of the same traits that we see in Jelling, the completely square palisade and moat, but also some buildings that belong to this aristocratic architecture with a main hall, a smaller building in a separate enclosure and so on. And last summer, we were surprised at the lower picture, because suddenly, without it being obvious, there was evidence of a 50-meter long hall just next to the palisade and moat, indicating that this was an important site. Whether it was a predecessor of Jelling, as the excavators would like to see it, I don't think so, but that's a matter that we're going to have to discuss a bit more before we finally conclude. So I think my time is almost up, but I was just going to show you some pretty pictures and a bit more about the implications of what we found. So what we have now is in Jelling a complex that is added to the circular fortresses, to the Dannevirke, to the Ravning Enge Bridge. and what we could call a language of power, or an architecture of power, where the resources and the technology required to build them is in part contributes to the visual manifestation of power. And if we look at Jelling, why Jelling? Where is it? That has been an ongoing debate. Why build the monuments in Jelling? Because there was nothing there. This was just a normal rural community, to all appearances anyway. But if you look at it at a greater scale, as part of a geopolitical scale, then perhaps Jelling was not as badly chosen as you might imagine, because it is actually placed evenly or very suitably in relation to all the land routes and the sea routes. We have land routes through Jutland that intersect around Jelling. We have it lying a bit behind, not exposed directly, but to an east-west route through Denmark. It is very suitable if you want to sail to Jelling, that you sail down to the nearest stopover point in the Lillebælt, where we had that site that had overlooked the Eretsu site. And you can see here, if we put in, the whole area would be rather suitable for a meeting point, for some kind of political event involving all of Denmark, which at this point would have included parts of present-day Norway, present-day Sweden. So Jelling would actually be suitable as a meeting place for all the peers of the kingdom to draw together, and then also for delegates from perhaps Germany to arrive at the same place. And what would they then do there? That is the question. And I think we could look at other things that could bring us towards that. First of all, what do we have in Jelling? We have tradition. We have traditional monuments that have been used for centuries in Scandinavia. Huge mounds and stone settings. They are put together in a new fashion, and they are built to an exaggerated size. If they really built or planned a ship setting 350 meters long, then it would have been so large that you wouldn't have seen it as a ship. And I think that some of this, the choice of monuments, has something to do with the past in the present. That the use of archaic monument types is something that creates a link to important age-old sites. And perhaps in Jelling you could see the choice of archaic monuments to build something that has been seen elsewhere far greater. But you could also see it as implying a time depth in Jelling that isn't really there. So you've got this time depth implying legitimacy for the king and his rule. You've got this visual demonstration that here we are a legitimate royal family, the king has his right to rule, we are age old without actually being age old in Jelling. And we are tied in with the royal sites elsewhere in Scandinavia. So we see this point of reference in Scandinavia where you look to the other age-old sites in Scandinavia. We have the royal estates, we have the assembly sites, the residences, and the old monuments. We have the great halls. We still cannot be quite sure what the building at the centre of the Jelling complex looked like, but we could imagine that it was a hall. And halls of power, they were also a shared ideal. You see some of these buildings, there are more square meters under the roof than in many houses today. So you've got these hundreds of square meters. Something important went on there. And I think they can be compared with the halls elsewhere, but in a different architecture. And I think it's a coincidence that the colouring is similar, but I think if you can imagine that you've got this great hall where ceremonies took place. We can see the controlled space, that you have a clearly defined space. You're in or you're out. And once you're in, you might imagine that there were patterns of movement, that you had a controlled way of using that space. And here we've got Jelling in a very early tentative reconstruction with more buildings than we've got evidence for. And we've got Aachen, the Aachen of Charlemagne. If we look at another thing from Charlemagne's reign, we've got the Pfalzkapelle in Aachen. Contemporaries of Charlemagne, they described this Kapelle, Pfalzkapelle, and in these terms, Einhard, he described the structure. And you could take those exact same words and apply them to the structures that were built by King Harald Bluetooth, or commissioned by him. So if you look beyond the physical form, you could say that the complex of King Harald in Jelling, his fortresses and his Browning-Inge Bridge, they could also be described as works of amazing ingenuity, the Opera Mirabili Constructa. So they were, you would also there emphasize the skills required to build them. You would also focus on the extraordinary scale compared to on other contemporary sites. And if you looked at King Harald's runestone, you would emphasize the exceptional beauty of the monument. So even though they're very different, we could imagine that the size of Jelling, the impressive architecture, the unusual details, the aim of that would have been to overwhelm the senses. So the point is to create a stupor danorum, like the stupor danorum that the Danes might have seen or experienced themselves when they were traveling to the courts of the German Empire or the German Emperor or elsewhere. You can see here, death, burial, commemoration. What was the point of the South Mound? There is no burial, but the point may have been to create the image of two royal burials. And that is that image that goes over into the tradition in the early medieval period. And why two burials? Was the aim to have two identical burials, was that perhaps coloured by the fact that Emperor Otto's two parents were buried in Quedlinburg in Germany in two identical graves in a confessio that was built by Matilde? I think this is suggestive, especially because a Danish delegation was actually in Quedlinburg in 973, so that's around the time when the South Mound was commenced. Did they come back and say that if you've got two parents, you've got to have two monuments, so that people can decode two monuments and see that you've got two parents? And when we look at the Kuntura who has vanished, wives and daughters, the importance of women, this is very subtle evidence, but we can see the Queen Thyra mentioned on two runestones, and the wife of King Harald, she also raises a runestone, not in honor of her husband, not in honor of her brother, but in honor of her mother. And she then also continues to say, who is she daughter of? So all this with alliances, you want to align, or you want to create alliances, and the women were part of this. You can see here the sarcophagus of Edith, the granddaughter of Alfred the Great, who was the first wife of Otto I. His second wife is Adelaide, so he turns his attention perhaps from England towards the south. He marries Adelaide, and you can see in this also that focus on family, the generations. Otto I and his son, Adelaide of Italy, and Theophany. It was deemed at the time something really important that you have the generations and that you follow the bloodline. Thietmar of Merseburg, who writes slightly later, he stresses the importance of the bloodline. And now I'm a bit over time, but just a few more minutes, a few pictures of new finds that we have. So here we have the family. We have the family that is increasingly important. And you have the allies that are increasingly important. And how do you get your allies? Well, you give them something. You have gifts. And the meeting in Quedlinburg in 973, it is stated by Thietmar that everyone joined, all the delegations were there, all matters were resolved, gifts were exchanged, and everyone went happy home. And I think we don't know what the Danes might have brought back with them, but we have a few finds that could suggest what they brought with them. They may have brought caskets with them, they may have brought filigree jewellery with them, and some of this filigree jewellery comes up now with the detector finds. So we have quite a few very significant finds, and some of them have been found in southern Jutland, the area between Jelling and the southern border. So maybe this is where we should look for a favoured residence of King Harald. We shouldn't look just for one, because the kings of this time were itinerant, but there may be a place that was, well, favoured by him. So new finds coming up, things like these that belong in the 10th century. Were they made in royal workshops? Were they made in King Harold's workshops, as some believe? No, we haven't got anything in Jelling, but we have a few finds from the fortresses and from Hedeby, the trading town of Hedeby, which indicate that this may have been where the royal craftsmanship worked. We have King Harold's coinage, so that he had ambitions on a very small scale, also for communicating his role as Christian ruler, and also emulating the coinage of neighboring countries. So to sum up, we have now a new site. We have a different view of Jelling. We have Danish kings in the middle and second half of the 10th century who balanced between a European elite and a local population who were to accept the king's rule, understand the messages that were embedded in monuments like the Great Runestone. Jelling was a memorial, probably also an assembly site, and the purpose of it was possibly to strengthen, legitimize, and visually communicate the claims and the rights of the king. And once that had been established, consolidated, his son had no need of the site, and it fell back again. There's no repair of the palisade. It was removed by burning, possibly. Anyway, that's what we believe at the moment. And the thing that remains of Jelling is the memory, but not the site as such. Thank you very much.